All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you everybody on Zoom who is joining us virtually. Welcome to the August meeting of the Southern Piedmont chapter of the North Carolina Native Plant Society. My name is Craig Maxwell. I'm one of the co-chairs of the chapter, along with Laura Domingo, who's sitting right in front of me. And she's waiting. Today we have Dr. Neil Pederson here to talk to us about dendrochronology and learning the history of the land through the trees and how the trees can speak to us. And with that, I will let Amy go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Welcome everyone. It's really great to see you here, and also so many of you joining us on Zoom. If you have not been to campus before, I'm so glad you're here. Please take time to visit the Botanical Gardens. It's just down the slope. The UNC Charlotte Botanical Gardens has 7 acres in native woodland, the Millichimp Native Terrace, which Craig mentioned, and a balance of 3 additional acres in landscaped, more ornamental, non-native plants. And it's absolutely gorgeous all times of the year. So welcome. Thank you to the Southern Piedmont chapter for allowing the gardens to once again join you and help host and partner for the annual meeting. This has been a really great event over the years that I've been with it, and I'm sure long before that. But without further ado, I wanted to introduce our speaker. Dr. Neil Pederson is the senior ecologist at the Harvard Forest. And he was actually a former professor of mine. I attended Eastern Kentucky University, did an intensive field botany program essentially, and Neil was pretty much joined the university about the same time I did. So I was working on my master's, and he was working on getting tenured, I imagine, and so I took some courses with him and went out in the field with him as well, and he is just a wealth of knowledge. He's a tree maniac, and in the best kind of way that we can all admire. For those of you that weren't able to join us today, he led a workshop on coring trees over the last couple days. And aging trees with those cores, and then painting a story with those cores as well. Very fascinating. Hopefully we can get Neil to do something similar again in a few years, and it's definitely something to check out. But Neil has made an incredible impression in my life, whether he knows it or not. I took old growth forest ecology with him, and it opened my eyes to a lot of misconceptions and ideas, which you'll learn some about today. So, Neil, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah.
Thanks, Amy. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. Thank Amy, Laura, and everyone that helped set up this weekend for me. I'm really happy to be back in the Carolinas. I did my master's at Auburn University, but my fieldwork was in the Congaree. And I spent a lot of time in the southern Appalachians, and you could tell maybe from my voice I'm from near the Adirondack region of New York. So the move down here was really eye-opening in terms of plant and tree diversity. But today I want to just share with you some of the things we've learned about our environment and time and the dynamics of human and environmental history, and with a little bit of special focus on the Carolinas. Before I get too far into it, I want to, I'm gonna try to get the, how do I do it again? Oh, printer out. Yeah, I'm gonna turn on a laser pointer. There you go. All right. I want to acknowledge all the trees that we've sampled, thousands of trees. So what you hear me say that I think I know came from the trees pretty much. So I have to, thanks to thousands of trees that I've been able to study with a lot of people. So the middle panel are the many people that have helped me in the field or in the lab. This is a really labor-intensive work, actually, and during my dissertation, 100 people volunteered to help me in the field, so I'm really grateful for that. And then the many different organizations who've helped pay for the funding. It's not too complicated in some ways. We use Elmer's glue and sandpaper and masking tape and pencils, so that's pretty straightforward. But it takes a lot of help with people, and you have to pay people. And so many thanks to the institution to help me gather and synthesize these data. I am duffing along and writing a book called The Memory of Trees, and some of what I'm going to talk about today will be in it, I think. Probably, we'll see. But that's Johns Hopkins University Press. I have the first few chapters done and many other half chapters done. It's coming along. I used to ask, oh, I hope you're here because you like trees. I know you like trees because you're the Native Plant Society folks. But what I want to ask, and I'm sorry we can't do this as much, or you could type them into the comments and maybe Craig can read them out, but why do you like trees? Why are trees special to you? Oh, don't be shy.
Shade.
Shade, yes, in the summer.
Oxygen.
Oxygen, yeah, for sure.
Just makes me feel good to be around trees.
Makes them feel good to be around trees, for sure.
Architecture.
Oh, the architecture of trees. Oh, yeah.
They feed tons of wildlife and insects and all that.
So, habitat, homes for wildlife, insects, birds.
Mystery.
What, excuse me?
Mystery.
Mystery.
Just the
Oh, I like that one. That's a new one. I've been doing this for a while. I've not heard mystery before. That's a new one. That's really great.
One of our attendees online just says they're beautiful too.
They're beautiful too. That's really a good thing too. And I agree with all that. And I also say that, up north, winters can be cold, so I heat my home with wood. And I love wood for that. I cook our food with wood. And I like building our new room with wood. So, I mean, there's many, many aspects, many reasons why. I've been doing tree ring analysis seriously, in a good way, I think, since the mid-90s or so now. And what I've come to love about trees is their persistence. This is obvious, but trees can't run, right? But when there's a hurricane, ice storm, snowstorm, anything that's coming, we can go get shelter. Animals, bears, birds, they can go get shelter. When it's dry, you can go to the river, you can go to the lake, whatever, and get your water. Trees can't do that. And that's really, I always start here, and I always say the obvious. Sometimes I'm Dr. Obvious. But I always say that because I want you to really appreciate how the top picture is the Congaree, a floodplain forest. Some of those cypress can be 500, 600 or more years old. And when the water rises 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 feet, they have to take it. Even if it's springtime, they have to live there. And then the ridge top in the back is Mongolia. I've done a lot of research in Mongolia. Could be Montana, it looks very much the same. And those trees on the top of the ridgeline are exposed to dry conditions in Mongolia, cold conditions in Mongolia. It's more of a monoculture forest, so the insects do well, like we're seeing out west, the bark beetles and the pine beetles and all those things, and ice and all these things. And if you're a successful tree, you live 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 centuries, and you take all that. And that takes persistence, adaptability, plasticity, and all that. And by learning the rings, studying the rings of a tree, that's what I've learned, that they're incredibly persistent and adaptable. So I don't know much about art. I know what I like and what I don't like, pretty much. That's as deep as it goes. And the first time I saw this, I went, oh my gosh, that's the lives of trees. So from what I've learned from trees, from their tree rings, this is what I think about the inner lives of trees. A lot of people say trees make them feel peaceful because they're still and they don't move, right? But on the inside of the trees, they're constantly active to survive a swirling environment for centuries. And so when I see this by Klimt, I see the inner lives of trees. They're very active, much more active than we might know and imagine, as we're learning right now. And maybe I am a tree maniac. Maybe I'm really oblivious to things, but it took several lectures for me to show this picture and realize that there are people in this picture. I only saw the trees. So, Amy, you were correct. All right. And so what you're looking at right here are what I like to say are the memories of trees. And what you see here, and I'll start on the left, this sample right here is a core sample from a tree. This is from Bhutan. And there are 1, 2, 3, there's a dozen tree core samples. I got the core trees in Bhutan, including a cinnamon tree, which was really fun. And these are just core mounts in between. But what you can see is, here are the rings right here. They're the horizontal lines on the screen. and they're spaced differently over time. We look over here, there are narrow rings here, and then they get really wider. The density of the wood, the color of the wood changes, and this is the tree adapting to what's happening on the outside. And so there's a lot of information staring at you right now on the screen. And then inside the wood, my colleagues are developing ways of looking at the density of wood, looking at the structure of the wood, looking at the chemistry of the wood, and then getting more information from what the trees have experienced over time. And so what you're really seeing is a ton of information. And so we had an artist at the Harvard Forest, where I'm at now, I can say that. He came to do a fellowship, and he talked to me about my science, and I said, well, among the many things that trees are to me, they're also stores of information. So they're like a thumb drive, and so he created that dendro data stick, which is fun. I have 2 of them. He gave me one, I bought one. But for the longest time, our science is officially over 100 years old now. This is not anything truly new. And in fact, Da Vinci and Pliny the Elder had observations about trees and tree rings. But we often say trees are recorders, scribes, blah, blah, blah of history. I got a little bored of that, so I looked up this Locke quote. It's real. I found it I found it in a real document after I found it online, and it says that learned dust and noise of the chronologist is wholly to be avoided. The chronologist is the tree, keeping track of time. That learned noise and dust of the chronologist, to me, that's the swirling environment around the tree and what it's capturing in a sense in its architecture and its rings, and that's what we're learning from. And then the last phrase is to wholly be avoided. I really love that phrase to describe trees and tree rings, because trees confound our understanding of the world, in the sense that we have things we think about how the world works, and then the trees go, you better think again. And so if you don't want to know the truth sometimes, don't ask the trees, because they are wholly to be avoided unless you really want to learn. And so, who slept here? Really don't be shy.
George Washington.
Exactly. Are you from the New York City region? No. That is the answer. When I'm in New York City, there's a chorus of people going, George Washington. George Washington slept everywhere in the New York City metro area for years, apparently. Something like that, every house. And anyways, this is the Day Mansion in New Jersey. And, George Washington did indeed sleep there, they say. And I was asked to tell them when the trees were cut down before they built the house. And so you find yourself in crazy places sometimes that you don't expect to in life. And there I am in the upper part of the Day Mansion taking a sample from one of the beams. That cross beam right here, this is a tulip poplar. And that's an important part of this story. And so what you're looking at right here are 2 tree ring sections, two tree ring cores of tulip poplar. Here are the rings right here. Here's one ring right here. Here's another ring. This dot is 1760, this dot is 1770, and then this full ring here is 1771. And there's a way we can put calendar dates on this. We don't just ring count, but I don't want to bore you with that, but we can put calendar dates on rings accurately. And so when I looked at this, I said, oh, the trees were cut down after the 1771 growing season. That's really great to know. So it could have been October, November, into the early spring. In the basement of this house were these large oak beams, like literally oak beams that you don't hardly see anymore. And here's an oak ring. They're a little more complex. These are pour vessels right here. This is the wood right here, and together that's one ring. This is 1750, 1760, and then here's the 1770 dot. It's the same one down here. It's hard to see, but this is 1770, and here's the 1771 ring. We have exact agreement. Both the oak and the tulip poplar say 1771 was the last year these trees were alive. Except, a couple days later, I went back to these samples because they're a little rotten on the outside, and I just wanted to make sure I was seeing what I was seeing. And then I noticed this. Do you see those 3 pour vessels inside that yellow box? That's a huge clue. So those are the beginning of these pores right here being formed. And what we know about oak trees in general, it's a very broad rule of thumb we're still learning about, is they create these pore vessels at the end of the winter, before the leaves come onto the tree. So they have to get the water from the roots to the shoots, so then they can grow the leaves. And so when I saw these pore vessels being formed, then I said, oh, this is 1772. And not only that, it's probably March. Maybe it's April. It could be May if it was a late spring, but it's actually late spring 1772. And that's how accurate and that's how powerful tree rings can be. When I started doing tree rings, I was a young man, too restless to sit down and pay attention to things, and I didn't do a good job. But once I learned that they had stories like this specific and this powerful, then I was like, okay, I will do dendrochronology for the rest of my life. So, one of the best stories in eastern North America comes from here in North Carolina. This is the Blackwater River out in eastern North Carolina. It's about an hour north of Wilmington, and it's home of the oldest documented trees in eastern North America. Last November, I had the opportunity to go sample down there to put in plants. David Staley, who I'll talk about again in a second, was the one that found these trees almost 30 years ago, I think, maybe even more, and went back again and proved their age. And so we got to kayak into the river flood system and core trees, and it was just really a great experience. You know, the trees after 1,000, 2,000 years take on really unusual shapes and architecture. And I remember looking at this. I've never been to the Serengeti, but this made me feel like almost like I was in the Serengeti. There's a grass understory, and then you have these flat-topped, really amazing trees, all kinds of crazy, wild shapes there. And you know, if you sit still for 1,000, 2,000 years, you get hit with a few things like Hurricane Hugo and many other things. But like, look at this tree. The top was blown out. One branch survived, and now it's reforming its crown. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is a 2,000-year-old tree. The oldest tree that's documented in this stand is 2,600 years. Wow. And they probably lived 3,000 years. That's probably how long they live. I mean, look at these forms are just gorgeous. I just love these. And so David Staley in 1998 published a paper with other people that addressed the Roanoke colony and addressed the Jamestown colony. And I'm not going to get into the details, but historians and archaeologists for a long time has talked about poor management, poor relationships with their neighbors, all kinds of things of why the Roanoke colony disappeared, why the Jamestown colony almost failed. And then the bald cypress in the Black River and Dave Staley came along and they said, oh, and you know what else happened? These were some of the worst droughts of the last 1,000 years. So let me zoom in a little bit on this figure, and I'm going to go through this a little slower. So on the y-axis is July drought, essentially. Above this straight line is wet. Below the mean line is dry. And from 1200 to 1998 was when this was published. And 1587 is the Roanoke, when they were dropped off in 1587, and they went back in 1589 and they were gone. And then this is the Jamestown colony when it almost failed. And now this is new. I don't remember what the next slide is, but let's see. Oh, good. I zoom in even more. And so what Dave found through the work of the tree rings is that the lost colony landed there during the worst 3-year drought of the last 800 years. The Jamestown colony landed there during the worst 6-year drought of the last 500 years. And so maybe it's management, maybe it's poor relationships, maybe it's being in a new land, but maybe it's the lack of water. It might be, I'm sure that's an important contributing factor. And in fact, one interesting thing that Dave Staley did with the Jamestown is they went through the diaries and they looked at the mortality rates of the people in the colony. And when it rained less, more people died. When it rained more, fewer people died. There's a pretty strong relationship between water and life. It's not rocket science, but the trees gave a new context to this history. It's controversial. Historians are upset about it. Archaeologists got upset about it. They're probably accepting it more now, but 30 years ago or 25 years ago, some of these things were very controversial. And I can see some of that sometimes, but this is what tree rings do. They can add a greater context to some of the mysteries that we have in our world. And I just wanted to show you, this is a raw core of bald cypress. This tree was probably well over 1,000 years old, and it's just really beautiful wood in terms of color and all the rings, and I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, I've reconstructed climate from tree rings before, but I'm really a forest ecologist at heart, and so I'm going to give you a little short lesson on the ecology of our forest in eastern North America, but it also applies to parts of Europe and southern hemisphere and anywhere in the temperate zone where you get plenty of rain. And the story goes like this. To the best of our understanding, 1 to 2 to 3% of the forest dies every year. So if you see this darker tree right here leaning, falling over, let's say it died that year, it fell over, and it opens a small canopy gap, a hole where sunlight can then reach the understory. And so our understanding is then maybe next year, maybe this tree over here will die, and then maybe the year after that, maybe this tree will die. It changes over time depending on things. But at the larger scale, at the landscape scale, at the regional scale, according to this theory, the forest doesn't change much. 1 to 2% of the forest dies, and the gap gets filled by lateral branches, or new trees come up and fill that gap. But overall, even though it's a dynamic, changing forest, it doesn't change much. We could go back 400 years, go ahead 400 years, and the forest doesn't change much, if this is how the forest operates. And this is an important question in terms of climate change, because it wasn't that long ago when I was a PhD student, a lot of top forest ecologists in this region didn't think climate was important to our forests, because it rains a lot. Why do trees care about rain? They do, even in these wet forests. So this would say that even with climate change, our forests would be stable, which for us would be wonderful, would be great. Of course, we have hurricanes. I don't have to tell anyone in the Carolina about hurricanes. This is Superstorm Sandy up in the New York City area. And yeah, that knocked down lots of trees, and people have some serious stories about that. I remember that. It really did frighten me. But if you take another look at this forest, there's a lot of trees down, but a lot of the trees are still standing. It doesn't usually knock down the whole forest. Or if it does, it's just a tiny strip of the forest. I mean, tiny for the region, 10 miles wide, 12 miles wide, but not 100 miles wide, not 200 miles wide. And once you get a few hundred miles inland, the energy from the ocean is cut off, the winds get weaker, and then there's less of an impact. So hurricanes are big impact, but in some ways they're not big impact. The forest can absorb this. And so there are many things that can change our forests, but it's really gap dynamics that is the reigning theory. All right, so if gap dynamics is the dominant driver, then the temperate forests are stable. The letters that are cut off at the bottom says that this forest should be stable over time. That's the theory. But tree rings and trees have something to say about this. And so it kind of goes that if a tree falls in the woods, how's that go? If a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? Here, though, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to see it, did it actually occur? Does it get recorded? And the answer is, of course, yes, it does. So this is an old growth forest in New York State. These are large 300-400-year-old, almost 500-year-old hemlock. And these are young hemlock in the understory. And when this tree falls down, this tree has more light, more water, more space to grow. And this is what it looks like in the tree ring record. So on the bottom here, we have the bark. We cored this tree in 2014. Here's the inner ring over here, 1873, and this blue bar represents 67 years. And in this forest, 1938 hurricane came by, knocked down a lot of the forest actually, and you can see that that same length of bar, the tree it only took 6 years to grow that same distance, you want to say. So growth explodes. You can eyeball it, you can see it. We saw at Reedy Creek where a big oak fell down and the 2 oaks that we cored next to it, we could see when the large rings started forming. You could see this with your eyeballs. You can detect it with tree rings and statistics. And this is what it looks like in the tree ring record. This is ring widths in millimeters. This is time. This is a different forest, a different place. But a tree died here, and this is that explosion in growth. We can identify these moments, and we can record the disturbance history of the forest dating predating any other time when there are written records. Okay, so this is basically what I do. And this is my colleague Dave Orwig at the Harvard Forest. We started working on this in different labs 25 years ago. And we used to do this one forest at a time. So you'd core this forest, you'd reconstruct 300 or 400 years of history, which was really cool and really fun, and you'd write it up and you'd publish it. But today, ecology has gone global, right? I mean, ecology's always been global, but now it's changing faster at larger scales. And to me, sampling one forest told us something, but it didn't tell us anything about the region. Does the forest change in concert with each other, or is it stochastic? Is it random? And is it stable over time at large scales? So to address that question, I put together a team of folks to help me do this analysis. We published it in 2014 now, which is a long time ago, and we found something I think pretty cool. And so we took tree ring records that are available online from the International Tree Ring Data Bank, from old growth forests in the southeastern United States. This box represents near Michigan. This is, Alabama, Georgia. So the southern Cumberland Plateau, southern Appalachian region. We took about, 40, 80 populations, 1,000 trees or more, and we asked them, how did you grow over time, essentially? And this is what we found. So this is a busy plot. Let me help you walk through it again. This is a spaghetti plot. All these gray lines are the individual trees in the southern Appalachian and southern and Cumberland Plateau region. This is ring widths in millimeters. This is time. And 5 populations, 2 populations of oak in the Blanton Forest of Kentucky, Joyce Kilmer white oak in North Carolina. This is also in Kentucky. This is lily cornet woods, many different oak species. And this is a hemlock population in central Tennessee in Savage Gulf. And the solid lines right here, the colored lines, are average growth for each population over time. And what you see is between the late 1600s and 1774 exactly, you have average growth that is roughly less than 1 millimeter per year. And then suddenly, around 1774, all the populations start increasing in growth and maintain a higher growth rate for the following 240 years. And just what I showed you, where the tree falls down and the younger trees explode in growth, that's happening here, but across ecosystem types, across site types, dry mountains, a deep, cool ravine, and at a larger scale, from Tennessee to North Carolina to Kentucky, and we see it in the Smokies a little bit. That violates the idea of gap dynamics, that random stochastic disturbance. This says there was some event that killed a lot of trees at once, starting in 1774. This challenges the idea of whether our forests are stable. So, what could have caused this disturbance? And so I have a very smooth figure like the one Dave Staley used for the Roanoke colony. This is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Above the mean is wet, below is dry. This is smoothed out, but what you see is 1, 2, 3 droughts leading up to 1774 over about a 20-year period. Not every year was dry. This is smooth, so it makes it look like that, but that's not true. But it was 3 really severe droughts. And this is all from the tree ring record. And then suddenly, this period is when trees started dying. So drought is a contributing factor. I don't have to tell people who work with plants that drought isn't good for trees or plants or anything like that, but drought kills trees. Big conclusion there, huh? So drought is one factor, but it doesn't satisfy why it started in 1774 or 1775. And so then I remembered that a student of mine, Mivan Hopton, during my dissertation, started finding this. This is tulip poplar again. There's the 1770 ring right with this dot. 1, 2, 3, 4. And you can see how narrow that ring is. And then suddenly it's large again. And then we saw it, there it is right there. And then we saw it here in this sample. And this sample is the one that really opened my eyes. the wood broke right here, and I can tell you why that is in the Q&A. But do you see how this 1774 ring here is whitish in color? That says, and I can tell you why later, that the tree was probably defoliated. But we didn't only see that in tulip poplar, we saw it in other states and other species, and so I thought it was a frost event that defoliated the trees in 1774. So I started presenting this around the southeast to the various scientists and such, and people always told me what they knew that it was. And I was like, really? You know, that's really fabulous. And they told me it was insects. And I'm like, what insects defoliates across species in 1770s? It happens today with our exotic species, but I don't think there were many exotic insects in that time period. So I kept getting hounded with that question, and I finally decided to do something about it. So I talked to Kerry Mock, who's a climate historian at University of South Carolina, and he reconstructs climate history, climate records, weather events from documents, from diaries, ship logs, newspaper accounts. And I said, Kerry, where can I learn about a potential frost in 1774 somewhere in the Kentucky, North Carolina area? And he goes, oh, the Moravian diaries, go to this book, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, Kerry's amazing like that. And so I checked it out of the interlibrary loan. I was in Kentucky at the time, and I was walking home to campus, and I almost walked into the intersection because they opened it up and it said 1774, so-and-so was born, so-and-so died, so-and-so got married. Oh, and we had the worst frost event in the last 25 years. And so then I emailed Carrie. I'm like, Carrie, we got it right here. And then we just went a little wild and we started looking. So I'm going to take a little expended few minutes here. I'm going to tell you what the colonists saw and experienced that spring. So in Salem, the spring came early. People put their gardens in 2 weeks earlier than normal. They had been there for about 25 years. The Moravians had been there for about 25 years at this point. And then they said on May 4th, May 5th, and then again on the following night was the hardest frost that anyone remembers. Fruit of every kind is killed, so are the acorns and all the other nuts in the forest. The forest looks worse than in winter. And I was like, I'm happy with that, but there's more. Thomas Jefferson, up in Virginia, said the peaches at Monticello came in general bloom in March. So that was early for them. And then May 4th, the Blue Ridge of the mountains were covered with snow. And then on May 5th, he wrote that a frost which destroyed almost everything, even large saplings were killed. So small trees were getting killed by this frost event. And the leaves of trees were entirely killed. Before this, according to his records, there had been no instance that has ever occurred of any fruit killed here by frost in all other places in the neighborhood. Basically, fruit was killed all through the region. It just wasn't his spot, it was all through the region. Colonel Landon Carter, I think he was up in Virginia too. He said, I rode out to make a further examination of the effects of yesterday's frost. I could not conceive the severity of it, and in particular that the frost rising out of the earth is a joke. I mean, doesn't that sound like our language today? I'm like, that's a joke. But this was shocking farmers and people who worked in their garden every day for decades. They hadn't ever seen anything like this. The minutes of the Winston-Salem board were like, on account of the freezing of the winter grains, there is little proposal for selling sickles. So the business people were getting disturbed by this event. They're like, we're not going to sell any equipment. We're going to go broke this year. The Freedman Diary in North Carolina said, we're going to have short crops and high prices. This is going to disturb our economy. And then on May 20th, people are getting desperate, and they say, a certain gentleman says that he knows where there are 400 bushels whose owners are in debt to him, and he will take it in on the debt and sell it to the people here. So there's rampant speculation. How are we going to survive? People talked about going to Pennsylvania to get grain. This is my favorite one. 2 villages recorded that the panthers had been seen several times, and though they had not injured any persons, they have been fouled some. So in my mind, the ecological impact is significant. There's no fruit in the forest. The rodents, the small animals are coming into the villages because if there's any forest left, it's in the villages. And what do the top predators do? They follow their food into the villages. And so this is an ecological disruption. What do I want to say? Ecological cascade. It's affecting the ecosystem from top to bottom. I'm focused on the trees, but the colonists are writing about panther stalking villages. And so it's really a rough spring, is probably to put it mildly. And this is, from a geoscience perspective, this observation was really interesting to me. This is from Evan Pugh, near Winyah Bay in South Carolina at the mouth of the Petey River, so right along the coast. And man of very few words. May 4th, May 3rd, at home. May 4th, very cold. May 5th, very cold this morning. A great frost killed every tender thing. May 6th, a small frost this morning. But you got to see what this means, because here's Winyah Bay. It's right on the coast. This was so cold that it pushed the warmth of the ocean out to the ocean, right? It killed things within the zone of the ocean where you should have the oceanic, the maritime effect. It should be a little warmer there by the ocean. On the edge of the ocean, you should be protected from these frosts, generally. Like, the Atlantic Ocean is not a small thing. But this frost event was so severe, it pushed up against it, and it killed everything along the coast. And so I told Carrie, there's Carrie in the lower right, and he went into the literature, and he's found this everywhere. From Pennsylvania to Kentucky, down to Georgia. Down in Georgia, they said it actually killed trees. We have eyewitness accounts that it killed trees. So we found it in the tree rings. We found the frost event in the tree rings. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. And then we found it in the diaries that are lost to most of us. And so here's the tree ring record of this event. So here's the tulip poplar again. This is a chestnut oak in Kentucky. This orange ring is a frost event. And then Darren Rubino up in Indiana, this is a ash tree, and this fuzzy ring right here is the 1774 frost event. And now I have a colleague who's up in the Chicago area. He thinks he sees a frost ring up in Chicago. That's a huge frost event. We've never experienced anything like that since then, as near as I can tell. However, in 2007, and maybe Amy, you might remember, we had a frost event in Kentucky down to Alabama, and this is a tulip poplar, April 6, 2007. The trees look worse than death. The trees look like dead, right? There's that same tree on campus a month later. It still hasn't recovered. All right, there's a few green leaves there. And then by the end of June, so halfway through the growing season or more, it's got its leaves, but I'm going to tell you it wasn't completely refoliated. And studies of that frost event in Illinois has showed us that trees sometimes only recover 40, 50, 60% of their leaves after a late frost like this. So this is really a significant event, a real shock to the system. And so just to put this in greater context, these are historic killing frosts of the southeastern United States as recovered by Carrie Mock, April 1828, April 1849, April 1818, and then what we found first in the tree rings, and I told Carrie, and when we found it in the diaries and in the things, May 4th, May 5th, 1774. So that is, look how much later that is than every other frost killing event that Carrie Mock has been able to discover in the last 200 years. It's so much later. It's late in the growing season. That's a real damage to the system that they've recovered from. But well, we'll get to that too. So to sum up, why did the trees start suddenly dying in the late 1700s? And I think it's the prevailing dry conditions, 3 severe droughts, a very cold, a very late frost event after an early spring leads to increased and more synchronous tree mortality across the southeastern United States. And so our forests are vulnerable to extreme climatic events. They are vulnerable. The people who study pollen over millennia, they know this. The people who study 20, 30 years of records from plots that we've been able to set up, they don't quite know this yet, but the trees know this. The trees help me recover this. And it sounds like, oh my gosh, this could happen in the future again, and yes, it probably will. I don't know when, but maybe within the next 100 years. But I want to give you a resilience tour, okay? So I want to show you what this might mean in the future. And so, what do I mean by resilience? And that's a whole academic discussion that I don't want to get into. To me, resilience means the forest recovers. All right, so this is Blanton Forest in Kentucky where I first found this event. It's an old growth forest today that you should all go visit. It's 2,000 acres, old growth. It's really beautiful, and there's no sign to you and I right here that this forest had a big dieback in the 1770s. Not every tree died. Maybe only 10%, maybe only 15% of the trees died. I don't really know, but that's a significant event compared to what happens each and every year. 10 times greater than what we normally experience. So that's significant. Here's Savage Gulf, the hemlock forest, where it also really helped me realize that this event was here with my students. Beautiful old growth forest. You wouldn't know that a lot of trees died 240 years ago. The other thing to think about is we think about our old growth forests as these grand stable systems, and it looks like a lot of them in the southeast, a significant portion were put in place in one event in the 1700s. This is Lily Cornet Woods in Kentucky. Really, you should go visit this forest. It's really gorgeous, uncut ecosystems, and it's what we accept as, in some ways, if you think there's a perfect forest, these are perfect forests, right? They're uncut, full maturity, whatever that might mean. No sign that there was a big event 200 years ago. This is the Gregory Mountain Trail in the Smokies. Maybe there had been some logging in this forest, but it was really minor. Just a gorgeous forest. Joyce Kilmer, where this event shows up. Someone actually found this event, Craig Lorimer, in the 1980s. He did a study with tree rings with Joyce Kilmer, and you can see the event in that forest, the 1770s event, but he only looked in that forest, so we didn't know that it happened elsewhere. It was just an event in that forest. But now we know that it's everywhere. And you know, we lost the hemlock to the hemlock blade delgid in this forest, and the ash are gonna die, and it's a lot of sad stuff going on, but the forest recovers every time. So there's Joyce Kilmer in 1994, the two iconic tulip poplars. There it is in 2006. You know, they're still there. The forest actually looks a little more dense behind there than it used to be, but the forest is still there. And here's one of my favorite places in the Smokies. It's an old growth, uncut forest, 500-year-old trees, really beautiful. This is in 2006, but we have to face up to reality of today. Our forests are changing. It's not happening like it is in the western United States, but our forests are changing. And this is a really protected cove deep in the Smokies, hard to get to. I probably would have gotten lost if someone hadn't let me in there. And we went back in 2019, and it's changing. The hemlock are gone, the ash are dying. There was a severe drought, and you remember the fires of Gatlinburg? The Smokies burned too. One of the wettest places in the eastern United States, almost a temperate rainforest, just a few millimeters shy of a temperate rainforest, it burned. So these forests are really vulnerable to these events, but at the same time they're highly resistant. These canopies are going to fill back in. They'll fill back in very soon. So, despite trees being sessile organisms, sessile individuals, sessile beings, we see that the memories of trees actively record environmental history. They've informed us of a fuller history of the early colonists in Roanoke and Jamestown. They helped us relearn about the 1774 Great Frost, and then the subsequent ecological and human sociodynamics. It was really just sounds like a wild time in 1774. And then they showed us that they're amazingly resilient, from the trees to the forest to the region. But we have to acknowledge that all these exotic pests, pathogens that are coming in through trade, and our lack of attention, kind of caring about these things, is only going to keep bringing more insects and diseases in. The beech forests in the Northeast are going to be gone in about 10 years. The beech bark disease was killing mature. I hardly see any mature beech anymore. They resprout from their roots, and now there's the beech leaf disease, which I just saw across Pennsylvania, and it's going to kill all the saplings in 5 to 10 years. So, forests, I don't want to end on that note, but it's the reality. We have to do something about this. Climate change, drought is going to impact our forests, but I want you to know that they're amazingly resilient at the same time. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yes?
Yeah, it seems interesting, and I'm probably not the only one that thought of this, but when you see 1774, the first thing you think is 1776.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything that maybe Carrie found that kind of suggested that the issues that came from the colonists and the colonies potentially starving or having all of these agricultural issues, could that have led up to part of the rebellion as far as saying you still want stuff from us, yet we've got nothing because of these frosts? Do they think that there's a correlation there?
So we started talking about that, and we started doing a paper like that.
Can you try to paraphrase that for the people?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So the question was, 1774, of course, happens before the 1776 rebellion, whatever you want to call it, depending on which side of the water you're on. Had we thought about that drought maybe have been a cause of the American Revolution? And we started down that road, and then we stopped because it's very trendy right now to pinpoint important human movements to drought or collapse or some sort of weather disturbance, and we just decided we didn't want to go there with that. And it's a complicated thing. People sometimes, let's say we were doing it, we were talking about this somewhere, let's say in Mongolia, and if you say that, well, this only happened because of this kind of change in the environment, people accuse you of environmental racism. They're saying that you're saying that the people there can't manage their own lives, are not intelligent, and can't change their own trajectory. And that's not what we're saying, but it's a very, rightly so, controversial subject. I will say that there is a severe drought across most of the agricultural region from, let's say, Pennsylvania to the Carolinas, 1772 to 1774. And I will say that in 1927, Bob Marshall, the Wilderness Society, wrote a really cool paper. I think it's in Time or it's in Newsweek. It's really funny. He ridicules politicians. It's hilarious. And he did a little simple exercise. He looked at every American presidential election between, 1840 and 1920 or something like that. Up to 1910 or 1920, something like that. And what he did was he determined where the agricultural center is of the United States during each election. And then he looked at what the weather conditions were, precipitation, specifically drought, leading up to that election. And what he found was, not every time, but quite often, if there was a drought leading up to the presidential election, the incumbent lost. If it was a wet period leading up to the election, the incumbent won. And if back when we were more of an agrarian society, and we still are actually today, but when that really drove our economy, it's hard not to think that hungry farmers can be pretty upset and disturb prices. It's not their fault. It's not their fault. I'm not blaming the farmers, but I'm just saying, we know how that works, right? Farmers aren't making money, farmers aren't making food, food prices go up, people get agitated. You might want a new leader that can make your world a little bit better. So you think. So that's all I can say about that. That's all I want to say about that, because I'm not a historian, and it would take a serious study to do that well. But it's not unreasonable. Yeah.
I have a question about when you're taking the core samples of living trees. What impact does that have on the tree, and do you do anything to, prevent insects or whatever from crawling in there?
Yeah. So the question is, when we core living trees, do we do anything to prevent potential insects or disease that go in there? And the short answer is we don't do anything. The longer answer is because trees are sessile organisms that live for centuries facing ice storms, windstorms, snowstorms. And they have biological defenses like we do. Like when we get cut, we heal. When we put holes in trees, they compartmentalize. They form like a callus wood around that wound. And then in 2 or 3 years, they grow over that hole, depending on how fast they're growing. and that injury is healed in a way. So we have now a good number of studies. 20 years ago, I would say we would have one study. Now we have about 6 studies, including some in the eastern United States, where people have gone back to look at the mortality rates of cord trees versus trees that were not cord, and there's no difference in mortality rate. Back in the 40s, there was when this started becoming a bigger science, some people did those studies on smaller sample sizes, but they looked at what you're asking. And what they found was that basically we end up causing discoloration of the wood. People tried to culture diseases, fungus, or anything like that, and they couldn't find anything in the wood. They did find that in maple trees, maybe heart rot increased 10-14%, which is not insignificant. So we might increase the heart rot of maple and probably some other species. So we are causing some damage there, but we don't see any evidence that we're changing mortality rates. And once you start coring trees, you find that a lot of trees in the forest are hollow. So I'm not saying I want to cause more hollow trees in the world. What I'm saying is we impact trees, but there's no evidence that we're changing mortality rates. And trees are amazing, and I don't think our one injury is much. And I will say that I've had a lot of people still not be persuaded by that argument. So then I go, do you like maple syrup? Because you're tapping the same tree every year, and you're pulling sugar, which it needs to live, from the tree every year. And there are sugar bushes in Quebec and in New York State and Vermont that are probably 50, 80, 100 years old, and they're still pulling sugar from the trees. Now it takes some special management, but it talks to the resilience of trees. The people that do sugar bushing know that you can't put too many taps into a tree. You can't go all the way around the tree. You have to be very careful on how you do it, but we enter the tree once, maybe twice, sometimes 3 times, and then we don't go back, hopefully ever again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a couple questions online. One of them is, do you see fires recorded in the history, and how does that present?
Yes, that's a great question. Do you see fires in the trees? And so Mike Stambaugh in the eastern United States is probably the leading fire tree ring ecologist right now. He's going to be at the Harvard Forest next year. I can't wait. He's been doing this, and so what happens is quite often there are ground fires that injure the tree, much worse than coring, and they produce what we call cat faces. So they look like a triangle at the base of the tree. You can see these wounds. They're not uncommon. More common in conifers like longleaf pine, where the systems burn more naturally, or where they, by humans or nature, where the system burns more. And so I've done this work in Mongolia too. We actually, we take chainsaws. We don't cut the trees down. We do little plunge cuts with a chainsaw. You take out a little slab that's maybe 2 or 3 inches wide, inch or so tall, and you go into the center and you take it out and you stand it up, and you can see charcoal embedded in the rings. And so you can date those fires, and you can actually not only date them to the year now, as you might imagine after hopefully what I showed you, we can say that it burned in the summer, or it burned in the spring, or it burned in the off season. And so we reconstruct those fire histories by collecting so many trees in the landscape and then around the region. And Mike has just published a paper with his group of fire history in central Pennsylvania and red pine that goes back to the 1400s. So it overlaps with indigenous land management, which is really important for us folks to learn. And so yes, we can do that. And it's done all over the western United States. It's done all over the world. China, everyone's doing it now. A lot of people are doing it now. And I would say the really interesting thing in the Southwest, Tom Swetnam pioneered this decades ago, but he found that when you have a La Nina in the Pacific Ocean, which we're having a La Nina now, we're going to have another La Nina next year, they say, it doesn't rain much in New Mexico, and you're more likely to have fire. And so when you have El Nino, it rains more, and you're less likely to have fire. And he only found that by taking a large regional collection of fire history and identifying synchronous fires at a large scale. So it's a really, and you can see the impact of colonization in that region, because after 1900 or late 1800s, when a lot of sheep were introduced to that southwest. They ate all the grass and the fire stopped. And so you can see when Europeans moved into the landscape and how that differs when it was managed by indigenous folks. Yes, sir.
What do you see in the tree ring history in terms of major volcanic eruptions?
Oh yeah. So the question is, what do we see in the tree ring records about major volcanic eruptions? So you remember the 1774 ring where I said, oh, it looks white? In tree ring records, in the far north, at the high latitudes where the forest meets the tundra, or on the top of the mountains where it's a very short and cold growing season, when there's a volcanic eruption, it actually, if it's high enough into the stratosphere, it'll block the sun, or filter the sun in such a way that the earth will cool rapidly within a few weeks, within a few months, a few degrees. Average global temperatures drop 1 degree or more, which is actually significant. And what that shows up in the tree ring record is, we call them light rings, L-I-G-H-T. They're light colored. They look white like that. And so there is much less lignin produced in the ring, so the wood is weaker. Remember how the 1774 ring broke? That's a lack of lignin. And they see that in trees in cold regions after volcanic events. If there's a severe cold event, we have one in 535 that we've identified around the world, and so on and so forth. And it shows up as light rings, so we call those light years, and they're actually related to volcanic events of the last, well, they go back now a few thousand years now, but we have a good record going back to the last 700 to 1,000 years in the northern hemisphere. Yes, ma'am.
Have you cored any of the giant redwoods or the sequoias? You know, those
Yeah.
giant trees.
I haven't, and I've not seen a giant sequoia or the oldest known tree documentary, the bristlecone pine that can live 5,000 years. I've never seen those yet, which is a little embarrassing actually. Like, how have I not been there yet? I've seen the redwoods. I had a former student who's working in the redwoods, and they were building tree ring records, and the long story short is, making tree ring records out of redwoods is hard because of the way they grow down low where we can reach them. So they climb 100, 150, 200 feet up into the tree, and then they take core samples from up there. And they built records that are 1,000 years old. Tom Swetnam, who I just mentioned, had done work like this 30 years ago or more, and they have 2,000-year-long records of redwoods and fire history and all that stuff. I've not done it myself, but people have done it. Yep. Yes, sir.
What sort of challenges do you see happening with increased frequency in the coming years? And 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 500 years from now, what the way the climate's changing, and what sort of challenges are you going to face like that?
Challenges. You're probably not old enough. I don't know if you remember. There was this bumper sticker, Save the Humans, with a giant whale on it. I didn't understand it when I was younger. Now I completely understand it. The challenges are for people. You know, things are going to change. I don't want to be, there's a certain segment in science and outside of science where it says we're all doomed. I don't believe that at all. If you know Earth history, the Earth and life on Earth is not doomed. Humans might be making things harder for themselves. We know this, that's a statement. Dr. Obvious again, right? But for the ecosystems, it means adaptation, change. Forests in the Pacific Northwest and the West, Intermountain West, are now being converted to chaparral. I've seen it in Mongolia too. So you have a severe drought, you have a fire, the trees get killed, not all of them. You get regeneration, but because now there's more frequent fires, the seedlings are getting killed. And then another fire comes through, and there's no way you're going to get regeneration for a long time. So then it turns into shrubland. So you get ecosystem conversion, which is hard on the animal, flora, fauna, and people who live in that region. In our part of the world, you know, forests will get less dense, forests will get shorter. What that does for the insects, butterflies, voles, moles, flying squirrels, I don't know. I couldn't say. Some species will become less common. Some species will become more common. I think because I went to a geologic institute for my PhD, I think that's how the world works. It'd be great if it wasn't happening. It would be great if we listened to scientists 100 years ago that knew this was happening, or 50 years ago that knew this was happening. It'd be really great if we started. I'm glad the climate bill was passed. Oh, I'm so happy. But my gosh, it was obvious 40 years ago. It was and the oil companies did 40 years ago. So anyways, I don't want to get on that tangent too much. I don't know. I worry about the folks. I worry about people now. I worry much more about them than nature. Nature is amazingly resilient. I mean, humans are kind of here because an asteroid hit the Earth, right? You know, the dinosaurs would like things differently, but then they became birds and such and such. So I don't know. There's a lot of challenges. Water shortages in some regions are going to be really serious. Aquifer. I mean, you probably know better. You're younger than me. You're smarter than me. You probably know all these things. I don't know. I think it's really obvious. I think we've known for a long time. I don't know. We can always learn something new. We can always learn something new, and there'll always be surprises. But I think people have known what's going to happen for decades. I don't think there's anything new. It's just that, yeah, I think you can make a profit with green energy now, and I think that's the big tipping point. Honestly, I'm kind of cynical. I'm sorry about that, but I don't know. I don't worry about the trees. More worrisome are the exotic pests and pathogens in this. I mean, we lost the American chestnut. I would love to see an American chestnut. I would love to see American elm forests. I would love to see streets filled with American elm. They're gone. But now I'm watching hemlock disappear. I'm watching ash disappear. The beach was devastating to see. It was a really depressing day in Pennsylvania last spring. It's hard. It's changing really, really quickly. And I'm just hoping that, well, I'm knowing that plants will evolve and adapt. You know, at a lot of conferences last decade or so, I'd always hear people saying, well, we're going to lose biodiversity, and we probably are. And we're going to lose this species, and maybe we are. But the other thing is there's a thing called evolution that's always happening. It doesn't stop. So the plants and the animals will evolve and adapt, and there'll be new species. It's not ideal, but I take hope in that. And I take hope that humans are intelligent, honestly. You know, I've been really lucky to go many parts of the world, and one of the most amazing places I've been is in central China, in Sichuan province, north of Chengdu. And there's this place, they said, do you want to see the irrigation project? And I was like, do I want to see the irrigation project? Okay. It was amazing, because it was put in place 2,000 years ago by Li Bing and his son, and I'm sure a ton of other people. But Li Bing is supposedly the person who conceived of this, and it was to control flooding and to make agriculture easier there. It's been in operation for 2,000 years with 1 or 2 adjustments. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. Pyramids are brilliant. Machu Picchu is amazing. Ending up on the moon is amazing, but having a dam that lasts for 2,000 years, or an irrigation, it's so poorly branded, irrigation project. Now, I don't want to go see an irrigation project. I want to see a water control system that's been active for 2,000 years that can handle the Asian monsoon. But that's too long of a word, right? I mean, so that's amazing. And when I see those kind of things, I'm like, oh, we can do this if we put our mind to it. So, save the human? Yes, ma'am.
How do you think ocean health impacts the forest?
Oceans?
Yeah, I mean, do you think that you have seen through your studies a relationship that you could understand? I know it's kind of a big system. For me, I read in the newspaper the other day that a water bottle makes it to the ocean from Concord, North Carolina in 17 days. My neighbors, well, one of them in particular, uses quite a bit of insecticides on their yard. I know that it damages our forest, but ultimately all of that ends up in our ocean.
Yeah.
And what kind of impact will that have on our forests?
So the question is, what kind of an impact might the oceans have on our forests? And that's a really interesting question. I can answer it in a couple ways. First is the ocean, especially the Pacific, is a big feedback into the atmosphere and into our weather and climate. So the forest fires, I already said, the forest fires in the American Southwest are largely driven by ocean dynamics in the Pacific. The 1772 drought in the southeastern United States is partially driven by the Pacific Ocean, which is really cool and fascinating to me because the Pacific Ocean does have influence on climate in the southeast a bit, but it's weak and it's not consistent, but it could roar sometimes and cause a drought that fueled this big mortality event. So that was pretty cool too. I mean, the fun ecology to me, not that droughts are fun, but it's an interesting dynamic. But the other thing that I think I saw in eastern North Carolina, but I know other people are seeing, is that ghost forests are being created. You know what ghost forests are? Sea level rise, coming up so quickly in low-lying areas from New Jersey down to North Carolina, saltwater intrusion. It's not that the steady rise of the ocean, that is partly it, but it's the steady rise. And then when you have a high tide that coincides with a storm, and you get a big wave that goes well into the forest, forests are dying, especially in New Jersey, but down here in North Carolina, I think as well, because of the sea level rise and the influence of high tides and all of that. They're not adapted to salt water. So I sampled in the Albemarle Peninsula, it was 2005, and we sampled some pine trees that were hardly forming any growth rings in the last decade prior to that, and I couldn't figure out why. And then I started thinking about saltwater intrusion and saltwater rise. And I don't know that that's the answer, but we do know very clearly, I saw it in New Jersey this past spring, that forests are dying. Someone brought us there, told us about it, well far inland from where the ocean is. And so it has a very direct connection that way to the forest. Everything's connected. Yeah, I mean, we have cliches, but they're cliches for a reason. Everything's connected. Save the humans. Yes, ma'am.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, so in terms of ocean acidification,
Oh yeah.
would it be, if you only have two options for a tree, preferentially, in your opinion, would drought be better or acid rain? So it's still getting moisture, but it's not, but it really.
That's easy. That's really easy. Drought. Trees are adapted to drought. Trees have survived the worst droughts of the last 500 years. We have trees in the landscape that went through the 16th century mega drought, hands down. I was on a students committee in New York in the Adirondacks where they cored 20 populations of sugar maple, kind of an important tree, very delicious tree, very colorful, beautiful tree. And they sampled it across the gradient of high calcium or high rich soils to very acidic soils, and they looked at how the trees are growing. And according to that study, 400 trees, 3/4 of the maple trees are in decline, growth decline. And I had heard of maple decline and I was kind of skeptical of it, and then when I saw the tree rings, I became much less skeptical. And even though that we are making our air better, sort of, and we're putting less acid rain up and into the landscape, that legacy from 80, 100 years ago is still with us today. It drained calcium, I think, from the soil. So this is my opinion. We haven't confirmed it, but I can't think of any other reason why these maples are declining. Doesn't matter if they're big or small, old or young, they're declining. 3/4 of them are. And I really think it's acid rain. I think the damage to the soils is significant, and the recovery of the soils will probably take a century. If we can slow down acid rain, which we have, but we really haven't enough yet. So yeah, give me a drought. Give me a drought. Yes.
We have another question online. So a lot of the ecosystems you talked about were denser forests.
Yeah.
But has there been the same sort of research done in more sparsely populated areas like prairies or deserts where you don't have as many trees, and what are sort of the impacts and the differences that you see between those ecosystems, if any?
Of what? Different impacts of what?
the droughts or
Oh.
any of these sort of events?
Yeah, so what the question is, I was talking about dense forests where I'm working, what about less dense forests? The classic, what's the impact of drought on those ecosystems? One of the papers that really influenced me is Craig Allen, who was a USGS forest ecologist, put out a paper called Ecotonal Shift. The ecotone is where the forest meets the grassland, where the forest meets the tundra, whatever you want to say, but it's a change in ecosystem types. The beginning of this mega drought, the late 1990s or sometime in the 1990s, there was a severe drought in New Mexico, and the line of trees that were here suddenly shifted back a few kilometers, something like that. And so it just, that severe drought killed, even though it's a low density forest, which is generally more resilient to drought than denser forest. More dense forests are more vulnerable to drought. There was such a dieback of the pinyon pine that the ecotone moved within just a few years. And for an ecologist who thinks forests are stable, which is what I also thought for quite a while, and a lot of people did, this was a very shocking result. And so it's abrupt ecotonal shift in 1998, Craig Allen, and people are just now documenting this all over the place. But that was the first real landmark one of the modern era. You can find those in the past, in the tree ring and the pollen records. You can find those events in the past, but they happened in the past, long time ago, extreme events. Now they're with us, and now they're happening. And so that's one example. Boreal forests are burning in Russia that hadn't burned in a long time. I worked on a mountain in Mongolia where we put together a 2,000-year-long tree ring record of temperature in 1999. My advisor first visited it in 1995. By 2009, that forest was gone. There was a fire. And even though we had wood that was 2,000 years old, it's gone. It hadn't burned like that in 2,000 years, or at least 1,000 years, I would say. And it's just gone. So those events are happening quickly, especially in more extreme regions like that, where droughts are more common, more severe than where we live. I will say we've been lucky because we're in a wetting trend in the eastern United States. It's been getting wetter over the last 100 to 500 to several thousand years. So we are having drought. They are going to get more severe. Hot droughts are worse, but we are lucky, I guess, compared to other parts of the world because we're getting wetter, which is not good though if you live near, rivers. The flooding is really serious now. So I don't know. No one's really lucky, I guess. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any take on the whole, you mentioned earlier pests, with the emerald ash borer, do you have any inside knowledge of, does treating the trees actually work, or are we just prolonging the inevitable?
The question is, do I know anything about whether treating the trees work for things like emerald ash borer or hemlock woolly adelgid? And it does work, it seems, but it's really expensive and intensive. It takes a lot of human effort to get it out into the forest or in the parks or in your backyard. How long it lasts is a big question, but Pennsylvania is treating its hemlocks to the best of its ability. Kentucky had a program where they were treating their important hemlocks, whether it was in a park or along a road or something like that, or along a trail. It does work, but what are the consequences of that new chemical in the environment? I don't know. And I don't know, that's a hard choice. Do we use chemicals to save the American chestnut? I think a lot of people would. I've eaten an American chestnut, and it's delicious. Yeah, I would love to have more American chestnuts in the landscape. It's just we have these hard choices to make. I think it works. I would trust a lot of human experts, I guess. That's a hard question. I don't know.
Yeah, just because I have 2 huge trees and they suggested, and I did treat them.
Yeah.
But I just am wondering, okay, well, what if someone else, if someday I sell the house and they don't treat it, and it's kind of like, is it just fighting a losing battle? That's what I was trying to figure out.
If you're enjoying the tree every day, you're not fighting a losing battle.
Enjoying that it hasn't fallen on anybody yet, so I guess that's good.
Yeah.
All right, wrap up.
Okay. Thank you.